And it is wrap-up time for the month of June. And this was definitely a better reading month than May in terms of both quality and quantity. And we got two main reasons for that. One, I finished Mass Effect Legendary Edition on like the 3rd or 4th of June. So I read a lot more because I wasn't playing Mass Effect. And two, I was reading the Fitz and The Fool trilogy instead of the Raidwound Chronicles. Let's get into it. So, in the month of June, I read 8 books. We got 4 by Hobb. I read Project Hail Mary, which I have a review for. I read Red Rising on a Kindle. And I read Breach of Peace by Daniel Green and The Forgetting Moon by Brian Lee Durfee to close out the month. Oh, wow, that was the entire wrap-up. Oops. Okay, anyways, that is around 4,500 pages. Which I was very happy with, and a average rating of a very high 8.45, and that is partially mostly because of the first half of the month. But we started with Blood of Dragons, and if you watch my last wrap-up, you know Rain Wilds, the first 3 books kind of slowly got better, and this quickly got better, because this is pretty easily my favorite in the series. Gave it an 8.3 out of 10. It was really well-paced. Maintained tension fantastically, had kind of focused more on live ship characters instead of on Timara, who's kind of useless. So that was great. Had some really important moments for the entire series and some big moments. And great world building. Basically, it's still one point of view held this back from being like a book I absolutely loved, but still great book. Next, I went on to Project Hail Mary, which I have a review for, so I've talked about, but holy crap, this was good. I read this in 24 hours. It's one of the best paced novels I've ever read. Has a lot more heart than I expected. I can't talk about it very much. If you've read it, you know why, but if you haven't read it, read it, but go in as blind as you can, because the aspects that make it great are kind of spoilery, because it does go in a different direction than I was expecting. Expect a protagonist who's somewhat similar to the protagonist of The Martian. I think Ryland has a more interesting character arc, and more of a character arc than Mark Watney, but in terms of personality, they're very similar. So it was at this point that I binged, 9.4 out of 10. Exquisite book. It was at this point that I binged the Fitz and The Fool trilogy. So, starting with Fool's Assassin. This is essentially a slice-of-life book. Very little plot happens, and yet I gave it 9.6 out of 10. Introduces some new characters, reunites us with your old favorites. Easily the best slice-of-life book that I've ever read. Watching the relationships develop in this book was so strong. It is a very slow book, but it's not like... Assassin's Quest is also very slow, obviously, but it contains Fitz alone a lot, and I think Hobb's biggest strength is relationships and character interactions. So while there's not much plot happening, there's a ton of character interactions, which is why this book is so damn good. Wonderful start to the Fitz and the Fool trilogy. I didn't quite like it as much as Book 1 of Tawny Man or Book 1 of Live Ship, but still just exquisite. And then we had Fool's Quest, which is almost like the opposite, in that it's probably one of the tightest, fast-paced, most well-plotted Fitz book of all of them. It didn't quite have... This really had some emotional moments that stuck with me more than this did. This was still phenomenal. Really phenomenal. I gave this 9.3 out of 10. Both of these did kind of end on cliffhangers. This one, I'm not going to lie, I didn't care because I had Assassin's Fate right next to me. If I'd read this when it came out, I would have been a little bit pissed. Because it's one of the cliffhangers that I've read. But yeah, so I think 2 books into Fitz and the Fool, I preferred Fitz, the character, in Tawny Man. But the cast of relationships and side characters is as strong as it's ever been. And yeah, so this was wonderful, and this Crow is great as well. And then we moved on to Assassin's Fate, which is my favorite book of the month, And my favorite book ever. This got a 10 out of 10. It is the best finale to a series I've ever read because it is my favorite book I have ever read. This was so good. This is the longest Hobb book, and it absolutely earned the page count. If anyone tells me that this should have been shorter, I will fight you. And no, I will also send a glowing bald assassin after you. No. This kind of brings everything together. All the amazing interactions with the side characters are out of this world. It's paced fantastically. The world building is fantastic. The ending is so perfect and also just emotionally brutal. It's sticking with me. This is going to be hard to beat. So that, if you look at the month so far, I don't know how many books in, 1, 2, 3, 4, like 5 books in, was completely insane. Had only one book under 9.3 with my favorite book ever. It does start to go down a little bit. Next, we have what I read on e-reader. I read Red Rising by Pierce Brown. I thought Red Rising was an interesting story and had some interesting world building. I wasn't huge on it for the first 7 chapters, and then there's kind of a reveal, I think in chapter 8 or something, that was really interesting and made the story a lot more interesting. My biggest criticism of this book is Darrow. I find impeccably boring. I would almost, if I ranked my Red Rising characters after one book, Darrow would be, bottom quarter. Almost every character other than Darrow I find way more interesting than Darrow. Darrow, it's kind of jarring after Fitz and The Fool, which obviously is Fitz, but, even, obviously, compared to Fitz, he's weak, but even compared to anyone, he's, his abilities don't feel earned to me. He's so good at everything, and it's I'm a helldiver, which is his job to start. And apparently the skill set for being a helldiver is the most, transferable skill set ever, and it actually qualifies you for every job in existence. And he just doesn't have that much personality to me. I will say, if you don't like reading about... He's definitely not a passive protagonist. He gets shit done, I'll give him that. But there's almost 20 characters I would rather this book be from. Hey, maybe I have heard that this is the worst in the trilogy, and he's way more interesting than the next 2, so there's still hope for Darrow. But other than Darrow, I did like the book. It is a battle royale, but I thought it was a good execution of the battle royale. Had a lot of side characters with 10 times more personality than Darrow, which isn't an extraordinary amount of personality, but it's a good amount of personality. Obviously, you gotta love Severo, Mustang, etc. Really well paced. I don't think... After the chapter I mentioned, 8, I don't think there's a single chapter that doesn't advance the plot in a meaningful way. Yeah, so it was an interesting book, but I have some flaws with it. Well, also, the writing was fine. Wasn't great. Wasn't terrible. So I gave that 6.3 out of 10. It was an interesting story. I like parts of it. Just not a huge fan of the protagonist. And then my plan was I had to go to this bookstore to get Golden Sun, so I read Breach of Peace by Daniel Green. Obviously, big fan of Daniel, love his channel, very active in his Discord. I'm a moderator in his Discord. This was fine. Fortunately, wasn't a huge fan of his book. I don't actively dislike much about it, but I just feel apathy towards it. It just almost nothing landed for me. There's what's supposed to be an emotional moment, and I was just oh no. Anyway, and it's just... Anyway, the premise is interesting. I guess I could say, the kind of religious cult police officers. Thought was an interesting premise. But it's just everything about it was just fine. I'm not mad at it. I gave this a similar score that I gave Traitor's Blade by Sebastian de Castell, but it's the exact opposite in why it got that score. Traitor's Blade was I really like this, I really like this, I really hate this, I really hate this. This is just kind of I didn't dislike reading it, but I just didn't get much out of it. He didn't bore me, so I'm wondering maybe he could get me more invested with a longer book, but I gave this 5.2 out of 10 just because I just didn't really feel anything towards it. Wish I liked it more, but there it is. I didn't have the highest expectations towards it, but whatever. It was fun. Then a book that was not fine, that kicks ass, was The Forgetting Moon by Brian Lee Durfee. Physically, this book is really nice. But also, this is a absolutely kick-ass fantasy debut. I'm confused by why I had such a low rating on Goodreads. I will say it's quite world-building heavy, but I think it's got interesting characters. It's really well written. It's got a fantastically interesting world, especially the religions in this world. I think there's some things that really show Durfee's skill as an author. One is he's got chapter preludes that are some of the best chapter preludes I'd read, and they all come from like religious texts, and he does such a good job. All the like preludes feel like they're from like an archaic old religious texts, but the various religious texts have their own distinctive voice. And I mean, it's the same thing for the characters, but I thought like that's an example of the type of stuff he's does really impressive at. If I had to guess why people are giving it lower stars, I don't really get it. I thought it was an extremely solid, impressive debut. I guess it is pretty world-building heavy. The way world-building is delivered really reminded me of Robert Jordan. I think if you get along with Jordan's writing style, you'll probably, like, stylistically get along with this. And I don't mean to say, like, this is in any way derivative of Jordan, because I think in terms of, like, tropes, it's not super original, but in terms of, like, world-building and setting, it's one of the most distinctive and I think, like, pretty original ones that I've read. So yeah, I could see, like, this really being a good story for a lot of people who like epic fantasy. If you don't like epic fantasy, then you won't like this, because it's very world-building heavy. It's obviously big. It's relatively slow-paced, but it's an excellent execution. Great characters, great... I think one thing that really shows how good his dialogue is that he doesn't tag dialogue a lot, but I didn't even notice that he doesn't tag dialogue a lot until I saw someone else mention it, and then I was like, oh yeah. And it's just... when he doesn't tag it, it was always obvious who was talking. So it's not like I had to reread it to figure it out, which is not true of some people who don't tag their dialogue. Sometimes when authors do that, I'm kind of like, okay, I appreciate your confidence, but you're not as good at writing dialogue as you think you are. But Durfee is as good at writing dialogue as he thinks he is. So good job, Durfee. Kick-ass book. And that wraps up the month. I did then start my reread of The Eye of the World, which I am enjoying immensely. Reminded me why I love The Wheel of Time. We'll talk about that more later in the future, but already kicking ass. Anyways, we did this all in one take because I felt like it, but that is what I read in the month of June. Let me know what you read in the month of June, whether you read any of these books, whether you're planning to read any of these books, what you think of them, etc. Bye, everyone. I need a send-off.